You know what to do. You know what would improve your life. You know you should exercise. Focus. Work on your goals. Stop wasting time. And yet, you keep doing the opposite. You procrastinate. You quit. You return to old habits. You destroy your own progress. Again and again and again. Eventually, you start believing something is wrong with you. Maybe you're lazy. Maybe you lack discipline. Maybe you'll never change. But what if that's not true? What if you're not broken? What if you've simply trained yourself to repeat the same patterns for years? Because self-sabotage isn't a lack of potential, it's a habit, a pattern. And like every pattern, it can be changed. But first, you need to understand why you keep becoming your own worst enemy. Why do people sabotage themselves? Why do you keep returning to habits you promised to leave behind? At first, everything feels different. You watch an inspiring video, you make a plan, you promise yourself, this time will be different. And for a few days, it is. You wake up early, you work out, you stay focused, you avoid distractions, you feel proud of yourself, you finally believe you're changing. Then, something happens. You get tired, you have a stressful day, you miss one workout, you procrastinate once, you eat something you weren't supposed to eat, and suddenly, the old habits come back. You start scrolling again, you skip another workout, you delay important tasks, and before you know it, you're back where you started. Then guilt appears. You feel disappointed, frustrated, angry at yourself. You begin asking questions. Why do I always do this? Why can't I stay consistent? Why do I ruin my own progress? So you make another promise. I'll start again on Monday. I'll try harder next time. I just need more motivation. And the cycle repeats. Motivation, progress, discomfort, relapse, guilt, restart. Again and again and again. After enough repetitions, people begin believing something dangerous. Maybe I'm lazy. Maybe I don't have enough discipline. Maybe I'm just the kind of person who never changes. But that's not what's happening. You're not failing because you want to fail. You're failing because your brain is following familiar patterns. Patterns you've repeated hundreds of times. Patterns that became automatic. And every time you return to them, they become stronger. That's why self-sabotage feels so frustrating. Part of you wants to grow. Part of you wants to stay safe. Part of you wants a better future. Part of you wants immediate comfort. And every day, those two versions of yourself compete for control. The good news? Patterns can be changed. But first, you need to understand why your brain keeps pulling you back to the life you're trying to escape. If self-sabotage is so painful, why does your brain keep doing it? Because your brain doesn't care about success. It cares about familiarity. And familiarity feels safe, even when it's making you unhappy. Think about someone who spends years procrastinating, years avoiding difficult work, years staying inside the same routine. At some point, that routine becomes normal. It becomes predictable, comfortable, known. And your brain loves what it already knows, because anything new requires uncertainty, effort, risk, change. And your brain interprets change as a potential threat. That's why people often sabotage themselves right before making progress, right before starting a business, right before getting in shape, right before becoming more disciplined, because progress means becoming someone new. And becoming someone new feels uncomfortable. Your brain starts whispering, what if you fail? What if this doesn't last? What if people judge you? So instead, you go back to old habits, back to scrolling, back to procrastinating, back to distractions. Not because they're good for you, because they're familiar. And familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar growth. People stay in jobs they hate, relationships that drain them, habits that destroy their confidence, not because they enjoy suffering, because suffering they already know feels less scary than a future they don't. That's why self-sabotage isn't really about laziness. It's about protection. Your brain is trying to keep you inside a version of yourself that it understands, even if that version is holding you back. The problem is, the person you're trying to become will always feel unfamiliar at first. That's normal. Growth is supposed to feel strange. Success is supposed to feel uncomfortable, because every new identity starts as a stranger. And the people who eventually change their lives are simply the people who stop running back to what's familiar and stay long enough to make the unfamiliar become their new normal. Most people think their actions create their identity, but often, their identity creates their actions. Think about the way people describe themselves. I'm lazy. I'm not disciplined. I'm terrible at staying consistent. I always quit. At first, these statements seem harmless, just observations, just descriptions. But your brain doesn't treat them as descriptions. It treats them as instructions. Because people naturally act in ways that match who they believe they are. If you believe you're someone who always procrastinates, you'll look for evidence that proves it. If you believe you're someone who never finishes what they start, quitting feels normal, expected, almost inevitable. That's why self-sabotage is so powerful. You're not just fighting habits, you're fighting a story you've been repeating to yourself for years. And every time you fail, that story becomes stronger. You miss a workout, and your brain says, "See, I knew this would happen." You procrastinate again. "See, this is who I am." You give up on another goal. "See, people like me never change." Over time, your identity becomes a prison. Not because it's true, because you've repeated it so many times that it feels true. The problem is, identities can change. Not through positive thinking, not through affirmations, through evidence. Every time you finish something you wanted to quit, you collect evidence. Evidence that you're becoming someone different. Someone who follows through. Someone who keeps promises. Someone who doesn't give up after one mistake. At first, the evidence feels small. One completed workout, one focused hour, one productive day. But eventually, those small actions begin telling a new story. A better story. And little by little, you stop seeing yourself as someone who always sabotages progress. You start seeing yourself as someone who is capable of change. And that's where real transformation begins. Because the moment your identity changes, your behavior starts changing with it. If self-sabotage is a pattern, then fighting yourself isn't the answer. Because you can't hate yourself into becoming better. You can't shame yourself into consistency. And you can't punish yourself into discipline. Yet that's exactly what most people do. They fail once and immediately start attacking themselves. "I'm pathetic. I have no willpower. I'll never change." But criticism rarely creates growth. It usually creates more resistance, more stress, more avoidance. The truth is, self-sabotage doesn't disappear because you become stronger. It disappears because you become smarter. Instead of trying to force yourself to change the environment around you. If your phone keeps distracting you, put it in another room. If junk food keeps tempting you, stop bringing it into your house. If you keep procrastinating, make the first step ridiculously small. Don't promise yourself 2 hours of work. Promise yourself 5 minutes. Don't promise yourself an intense workout. Promise yourself 10 push-ups. Because the goal isn't to prove how motivated you are. The goal is to make action easier than avoidance. People often think discipline means constantly resisting temptation. But the most disciplined people rarely rely on willpower. They build systems. Systems that make good decisions automatic. Systems that remove unnecessary friction. Systems that work even on bad days. And that's important because bad days will always exist. You'll still feel tired. You'll still feel distracted. You'll still have moments when comfort seems more attractive. But if your system is strong enough, you'll keep moving anyway. That's how patterns change, not through one big decision, but through small actions repeated often enough that they become your new normal. And once that happens, self-sabotage slowly loses its power. Because you're no longer fighting yourself, you're working with yourself. And that's when lasting change finally becomes possible. Most people don't have a starting problem. They have a finishing problem. They start books but never finish them. Start workouts but never stick with them. Start projects but abandon them halfway through. And after years of doing this, they begin seeing themselves as someone who never follows through. Someone who always quits. Someone who can never be trusted. But the truth is, you don't build confidence by starting. You build confidence by finishing. Even if what you finish is small, a 10-minute workout, one chapter of a book, 30 minutes of focused work, a single task completed. Because every finished action sends a message to your brain. It says, I keep my promises. I follow through. I can trust myself. That's why trying to change your entire life overnight almost never works. The bigger the goal, the easier it becomes to quit. Instead, start smaller, much smaller. Set goals that feel almost too easy. Read 1 page, do 5 push-ups, work for 10 minutes. Then stop, and come back tomorrow. Because consistency matters more than intensity. People who finish things aren't special. They simply understand something important. Progress doesn't come from doing everything perfectly. It comes from refusing to disappear after one bad day. You missed a workout? Come back tomorrow. You procrastinated today? Try again tomorrow. You broke your streak? Start a new one. Because self-sabotage only wins when you decide that one mistake means you failed. It doesn't. One mistake is a moment. Quitting is a decision. And the people who eventually transform their lives are usually the people who made one simple choice: to stop chasing perfection and become someone who finishes, someone who returns, someone who keeps going, no matter how many times they have to start again. Because at the end of the day, success doesn't belong to the smartest people. It belongs to the people who stayed long enough to finish what they started. Most people spend years fighting themselves, trying harder, pushing harder, starting over, again and again and again. But the truth is, you were never fighting laziness. You were fighting patterns. Patterns built through repetition. Patterns built through comfort. Patterns built through years of doing what felt familiar. And patterns can change, not overnight, not with one burst of motivation, but with small actions repeated consistently. Every time you finish something, you weaken the old pattern. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, you weaken the old pattern. Every time you choose progress over comfort, you weaken the old pattern. And eventually, the person who always quit becomes the person who follows through. The person who always procrastinated becomes the person who takes action. The person who sabotaged every opportunity becomes the person who creates opportunities. Because self-sabotage isn't your identity, it's a habit, and habits can be replaced. So stop asking yourself, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what pattern am I repeating? Because the moment you stop seeing yourself as broken and start seeing yourself as someone who can change, everything begins to shift. One decision, one action, one finished task at a time. And that's how you stop becoming your own worst enemy.